Hi. So, in this mini lecture, I want to talk to you about some communication principles and misconceptions. To get started, we already got a definition of interpersonal communication in the last mini lecture, but I want to talk about two different ways of thinking about interpersonal communication that sort of dominate the communication field. So, the first way of thinking about IPC is the quantitative way of thinking about it. The quantitative definition of interpersonal communication is any interaction between two people, usually face to face. So there are some important terms that come with this. So when there are two people that are interacting, that are communicating with each other, it's known as a dyad. Again, this is just a 50-cent fancy word for two interacting people. So, as a result, we can use the terms dyadic communication or interpersonal communication interchangeably when we're talking about the quantitative view of communication. Importantly, from a quantitative perspective, this can also be an impersonal interaction. So, for example, if I call an Uber and I have to sit there and talk to the driver, which is always weird. It's always kind of a strange situation, right? So if I'm there and I'm talking with this driver and having kind of an impersonal, interpersonal communication. So what do you think about the weather? How about those Braves? These kinds of conversations. From a quantitative perspective, this could be considered interpersonal communication. Now, when we talk about the qualitative definition of interpersonal communication, this is when people treat one another as unique individuals regardless of context or the number of people involved. And there's some things that go with this. There's a certain uniqueness. No relationship is like any other relationship. They're all like pretty little snowflakes. There's a certain degree of irreplaceability of each party. So when I talk to my mother, for example, she's irreplaceable. There's no one else that can really fill that position. When I talk to my best friend Doug, there's no one else that can really fill that position. He's irreplaceable. There's also a sense of interdependence. Again, another fancy word that just means that our fates are connected. What happens to them matters to me. The best example of this is probably your immediate family. So if something happens to your father or your husband or your wife or your child, this is going to affect you as well. And also, when we think about qualitative definitions of interpersonal communication, this deals a lot with what we call intrinsic rewards. So the reward is just in the communication. There's no extrinsic rewards. Now, obviously, this is different than the kind of impersonal relationships that we can have with the quantitative definition. So I get in the Uber, I have impersonal conversation with the driver, and the reward is I get to where I'm going. In the qualitative definition, if I'm having interpersonal communication, then just that talk is rewarding enough in and of itself. So what we find, from a broad perspective, is that most interpersonal relationships incorporate both of these elements, both quantitative and qualitative elements. So with my wife, for example, we could have a really deep kind of unique discussion that's related to her irreplaceability and my irreplaceability in our relationship. One that has to do with our linked fates, and one that has where we disclose interpersonal information with each other, right? We could have this kind of really deep conversation. Or we can also have these kinds of impersonal conversations. Who's picking up the kids from school today, you or me? Are you going to get to dry cleaning? Did you clean the kitchen before you went out this morning? Oh, you see what I mean? So that's why we say that most of these interpersonal relationships incorporate both of these elements. All right, so one of the things that we need to know, one of the basic principles of communication that we need to be aware of, is that communication does not have to be intentional. You're communicating all the time, whether or not you know it. Indeed, trying not to communicate is a form of communication. I've had students in the past, for example, that come to class and think, well, if I don't say anything, I'm not really communicating. He can't make anything out of that. And then they put their heads down on the desk and shut their eyes. Now, putting your head down and looking like you're asleep definitely communicates something, whether or not you realize it. So we're all communicating all the time. We're kind of like transmitters that can't be turned off. There is no way to not communicate. Now, if I was an English professor, that phrase would upset me because it's a double negative. But again, I'll repeat it because this is communication class and grammar be damned. So there is no way not to communicate. You're communicating even when you try not to. Look at the girl in this photo in the middle. She's conveying something. She's communicating something. Even saying nothing is saying something. Again, we're always communicating. We're like transmitters that can't be turned off. The second principle that you need to be aware of is that communication is irreversible. My buddy used to like to say, you can't put the shit back in the horse. Once you've said something, once you've done something, you can't erase it. Once you say it, you can't take it back. You could explain what you meant, if you meant something else. You could apologize for the things you said. But that's really about it. So we need to realize that when we communicate, there is no taking it back. And this is really important when we talk about things like social media and email, where there could be a record of our communication. We'll talk about this more in the next chapter. But again, it's important to recognize that we can't reverse the things that we say or do. Now, we maintain that communication has both content and relational dimensions. What this means is that all exchanges, all instances of communication, operate on at least two levels. There's a content dimension, which has to do with the actual content of what you're saying, the information that you're discussing. And there's a relational dimension, which is how you feel about the other person. So, I could be having a conversation with my wife about the weather, but that's only one part, only one dimension of our exchange. The other exchange has to do with how I feel about her. Am I feeling affectionate towards her at that time? Am I frustrated with her? Am I angry with her because we just had a fight? These things are different than what we're actually saying. All right. So now that we've covered some of the principles, let's talk about some of the common misconceptions regarding communication. The first thing that you need to recognize is that more communication is not always better. Excessive communication can be unproductive. More and more negative communication often leads to negative results. So, if you're fighting, staying in the room and continuing to have an argument could be negative. It's not better to keep communicating if you're already at each other's throats. Even if the interaction isn't crazy negative, too much communication can still lead to undesirable outcomes. You could be beating a dead horse. You could be annoying the other person by talking about the same thing over and over and over again, not letting something go. So it's important to remember, more communication is not always better. Sorry. The next thing we need to realize is that meanings are not in words. Saying something is not the same as communicating it. Now, this goes back to the idea that I spoke about in the first lecture, where I told you that meaning is made in the head of the receiver. So what you say can be interpreted in different ways by different people. This has a lot to do with their fields of experience, where they're coming from. I might say something that is I think is totally fine, and you can interpret it in a really negative way. That happens all the time. So we need to realize that saying something isn't the same thing as communicating it. Just because you say it doesn't mean the message is getting across. That's something I realize every time I give a test, because I think that I've made my points clearly and that everyone's picked up on the message that I'm sending, that they've received it just the way I intended. But that simply isn't always the case. And we need to be aware of that. The meaning isn't in our words. Meaning is made in the head of the person or people we're talking to. And that's the only meaning that matters, really. Because you're trying to convey a message clearly. And you want the other person to get it. And if they don't get it, then you failed to send that message. Now this is really interesting to me, and this is sort of a theme that we'll come back to throughout this class. And that's the idea that successful communication doesn't always involve shared understanding. Shared understanding is only one measure of successful communication. Just think about all the times you say things that you don't mean in order to engage in successful conversation. Now, I've been asked by my wife and girlfriends over the years, do these jeans make my butt look fat? What's the answer to that question? We all know the answer to that question. It's no. No matter what. I don't care. No matter what. The answer is no. So sometimes, whether or not this is true doesn't matter. It's what we say in order to maintain healthy and successful relationships. In fact, one of the things we find, and one of the things that's explained in your book on page 19, is the idea that couples who think their partners understand them are more satisfied with each other than those who actually understand what the other says and means. I'm going to let that sink in for a second and encourage you to think about this. Let's read it again. Couples who think their partners understand them are more satisfied with each other than those who actually understand what the other says and means. So what this means is, as long as you think your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife understands you, you're going to be happier than if they actually understood you. So we all say, oh, I just want somebody who really gets me, somebody who really knows me. But that's not true. You're better off, you're probably going to stay together longer, if you just think that your partner understands you. That's better for you than them actually understanding. Weird, right? But it's true. Another misconception is the idea that communication solves all problems. It doesn't. You can talk issues to death and not solve the root problems. In fact, sometimes a clear understanding can make our problems worse. So as a result, deciding when to communicate isn't always easy. Now we all know, I don't know if you've ever seen an old couple, an old married couple, been married 50, 60 years. What you'll find is that in many instances, they have the same conversation about the same topics over and over and over again. It's almost as if they're rehearsing it. Couples who get divorced. One of the number one reason for divorce in the United States is money problems. Now, those people didn't argue over money one time and then go to divorce court. They argued over money again and again and again and again, and it still didn't solve their problems. So we know that we could talk about things forever and still not fix it. And sometimes, if people really do understand what we're trying to say, it's worse than if we don't, or if they don't. So as a result, it's really hard to know when to keep your mouth shut. All right, that's it for this mini lecture. Thanks for tuning in again.